So you got something to say about Sunset Boulevard? What you got to tell the people? No? Okay, bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, prepare for a cinematic odyssey through the 100 greatest films spanning from the roaring 1920s to the cutting-edge masterpieces of 2024. Carefully curated from the lovely people on Letterboxd. Two intrepid souls embark on a journey through a treasure trove of timeless classics and groundbreaking contemporary works, where each frame embodies the enduring magic of the silver screen. Grab your popcorn and join us on this epic expedition through a century of cinematic excellence, where every film promises to enchant, inspire, and leave an indelible mark on the soul. And now, for your listening pleasure, here are the LetterBros.
Welcome, everybody, to the second episode of LetterBros. I am Felix. This is my friend Parker. How are we doing today, buddy?
Hello, Felix. Doing great. Thanks for asking. How are you doing?
Feeling like a Hollywood elite, for sure. If you didn't catch the last episode, was kind of like our introduction to what this podcast and this channel is going to be, where we watch 100 movies from the last 100 years, all curated from Letterboxd. We let a wheel decide which movie we're going to watch next and review the ones that we watched, essentially. Last time, we spun the wheel for the very first time, and we came up with the 1950s classic Sunset Boulevard. Very classic movie. We both have our thoughts on it, and that's what we're going to get into today.
Yeah, I'm super stoked to discuss Sunset Boulevard. We kind of mentioned it when we drew this film in the last episode that we were going to dive into some classics, some that we've definitely heard of, but just had never gotten around to watching. So definitely a great movie to start off this podcast series with.
Exactly. And those of you who have not seen Sunset Boulevard, we'll go ahead and just give you the little blip of it, the synopsis of the movie, just so people are aware. Actually, I would love for Parker to use his best voiceover voice to read the synopsis of this movie.
I think your voiceover voice might be a little bit better, but I'll give it a go. So yes, this is going to be spoiler free, and then we're going to get into our spoiler free reviews as well before diving into our ratings and spoiler reviews. But just a quick synopsis of Sunset Boulevard, which did come out in 1950. It's a film noir directed by Billy Wilder. The story follows Joe Gillis, who's a struggling screenwriter played by William Holden. He's on the run from creditors and ends up hiding his car in what he thinks to be an abandoned mansion. Unbeknownst to Joe, it is the residence of forgotten film star Norma Desmond, portrayed by Gloria Swanson. Fun fact, Gloria Swanson was born in 1899, which just blew my mind that, her legacy is continuing to live on in 2024. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
Norma is caught in a delusion of a comeback to the silver screen, and Joe starts to become entangled in her grandiose visions, even offering to help her with her latest script. Meanwhile, he's taking advantage of some of the financial perks that come with this. All the while, Joe takes on another screenwriting project on the side with someone named Betty Schaefer, who's played by Nancy Olson. And she's an up-and-coming screenwriter herself, and Joe kind of sees a little bit of himself in her. So the story is tragic. The story is film noir, but not in the crime sense that you would think, that I thought at least personally. And it's a classic for good reason.
Yeah, and I definitely saw like those aspects of film noir in there. Just like, the voiceover, the shot selections that they had. It's funny because you were the one that watched it first, and I honestly thought that, well, funny enough, I tried to watch Sunset Boulevard first before Parker did, and it was like 5 a.m, and I was trying to watch it on my phone, and I had gotten through like maybe the first like 5 minutes of the movie, and I guess fell asleep. But when I woke up the next morning, the like replay button was still on there. So I guess I had watched the movie at some point. To your point, the film noir aspect, it makes this film feel very cozy, and it definitely has its place like in Hollywood, and it is fitting into a lot of the other films that came out in its era in terms of like the film noir aspect. So it is.
Well, I'm already excited to get into this because cozy is definitely not a word that I would use to describe this film. Would not be
well,
cozy.
again, if you haven't watched this movie, I would recommend watching it just to kind of fuel the discussion here. So if you haven't seen it, pause the video, go watch it, and come back and we will discuss this further. But we are getting into spoiler territory at this point. But also, the movie has been out for a very long time. So please go watch it. Almost what, like 70 years?
Yeah, right. Does it even really warrant a spoiler warning? I guess. Do we
Exactly.
really need to do a spoiler-free section? You've had 74 years to watch this movie.
And it's also been referenced in so many things, but we'll go and discuss that more. But all right. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this film, Parker?
Yeah, so if we're just diving right in terms of reviews and what my thoughts are, I started this movie off thinking, you know what? I always underestimate older films. Maybe it's just my own personal bias. Not that I dislike them, but I'm always hesitant to watch them for no good reason. And then I get into it and I find myself really enjoying it and almost being like surprised at how modern they still feel, if that makes sense. Like it doesn't
Hmm.
really feel like a time capsule or something that's completely out of place. These movies are classics for a reason, and that's because they're timeless. So I always find myself being surprised with the themes in these older movies still being extremely relevant today. When knowing that this is a film noir, I was not necessarily expecting what we got. And again, I think that comes from my own predetermined thoughts on what film noir is. And it's not a category of movie that I'm really well versed in. So I think this really was kind of my first deep dive into that genre of movies. And it definitely broke the mold of what I thought it was beforehand. Um, but I will say I enjoyed the movie. I think that I can appreciate it more than I actually like enjoyed watching it, if that makes sense. And that gets into kind of like the themes, the story that's being told. It is definitely a film that references a lot of things that were going on in its time. So it definitely is a synopsis basically of what happened in Hollywood when the silent film era was reaching its end and they started producing talkies and stars faded into the unknown, and if you couldn't really keep up with the ways that the industry were changing, then you weren't going to have a job in the industry anymore. So this is definitely something that did happen. It's a film that's based off of real people that were silent film stars, and even features real life directors. I mean, Cecil DeMille is in the film, correct?
Hmm.
Max von Meyerling is played by Eric von Stroheim, and we'll get into Max's character a little bit. And forgive me for butchering those names, but Eric von
It's okay.
Stroheim was
These actor names are crazy, dude.
he was a director in the silent film era as well. So definitely some interesting things at play here. I kind of thought that it was almost like, tell me if I'm completely crazy for this, but it reminded me of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and the way that it kind of portrays LA and Hollywood as this
Yeah.
city full of stars, and it references all of the different people that are in the industry in actuality at the time while still telling us this fictional story. So it kind of blurs the line between fiction and reality, which I always like when a movie does that gracefully, which Sunset Boulevard did. Forgive me for being a bit long winded here, but I will get into why I don't think that the movie was entertaining on a personal level. I felt as though, as captivating as Gloria Swanson's performance was as Norma Desmond, like the film definitely brought along that sense of dread that Joe Gillis's his character was feeling. And I felt that as the viewer, and I didn't necessarily enjoy it. So I appreciated it, but it was still kind of like I felt trapped there whenever we were at Norma's mansion, and it didn't really captivate me. Like there was nothing super serious that happened until the end where I felt as though the stakes were incredibly high. And to be honest, I didn't really care for the character of Joe Gillis either. He's definitely not a sympathetic main character, and I found it kind of hard to root for him. Like we can talk about the ending, I guess, because the ending is the beginning of the film, but I didn't really give a shit when he got shot. If I'm being honest, like, you know, so I think it's a really good movie that I can appreciate, and it's very well made and is still being talked about in 2024 for good reason. But it's not one that I think I will be revisiting, at least not anytime in the near future.
Yeah, so I honestly had not necessarily the opposite reaction to it. I actually really enjoyed this film, and it's definitely like an oldie that I would probably return to because like you see movies like Casablanca like growing up, and like my family really liked watching it, but I probably wouldn't go back to it unless like it was something in like on this format or if it ends up on the list. But there was just something about, and to your point, I was also thinking about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood while watching this because it almost feels just like a love letter to the art of filmmaking. And funny enough, the movie was produced by Paramount and it takes place on the set of Paramount Studios.
Yeah, I loved those kind of callbacks. And
Yeah, and this movie really showed me that I love movies about movies. It's always really fun to kind of see like a nice narrative based on the art of filmmaking. And this movie was just, to me, it just felt very comfortable in most aspects. I will agree that, yeah, Joe was not the best. He wasn't the best protagonist to like want to root for, like you said, like when he got shot, and I'm like, well, first, okay, we already knew that, and two, I'm not like, oh my god, Joe got shot. I don't have like any sort of like feelings tied to when he gets shot. I mainly was just like, I'm rooting for Norma at that point. You're like, yeah, shoot him. He betrayed you. Like he's not a likable character in that aspect. Like he's on the run, he's missing his payments, he's lying to debt collectors. He's not a very pleasant human being. And I mean, he's always trying to get out of any situation involving Norma, which to some fair point, yes, like he kind of has like Stockholm syndrome in that point where he's just, he's become this captor and now he's starting to like develop what Norma might call feelings, but just Joe seeing this as a way for him to live out his dreams and just buy a whole bunch of stuff that he was never able to afford and really just take advantage of this old woman and her wealth. So it's not really somebody that you can really root for, but I did really like that we got to see a lot of old LA. Like, we see a lot of like the older film sets. We see Schwab's Pharmacy, which is still there. It's just like a nice little, just locked in its own time. And I did really like that they included cameos, but they weren't like blatantly obvious. Like when I first watched the bridge scene when they're at the house and they had the other three silent actors sitting there, I'm just like, oh, these just are just regular people. But after doing research, we found out that all three of them were silent film actors, like in real life. So we had Anna Q. Nilsson, H.B. Warner, and Buster freaking Keaton was at that bridge game too, which he's an icon in Hollywood. I literally, on my notes here, I have the gif of him standing in front of the house as it falls right over him. I would consider him to be like a pioneer in stunts. Like he is the original stuntman in films. And we also have one of his films coming up on the list too, was Sherlock Jr., which is actually the oldest film on the list. So I'm excited to see that. It was just a really nice nod. And obviously like having actual like Cecil DeMille in the movie, being a director. And the thing that I was worried about seeing that it was like a lot of like real people, especially DeMille, since he has such a big part in the movie, was that it wasn't going to feel very real. But I mean, DeMille killed the role. Like he knew the assignment, he knew exactly what they were looking for, and
probably dealt with it in real life.
he probably did deal with it in real life. He was probably a piece of shit in real life too. Like,
DeMille?
yeah.
What? No, he was like the best, nicest character in the whole movie.
What do you mean?
He was
He was
sympathetic to her.
he was being so fake.
Yeah, but he thought he was doing it for her own good.
I mean, he was the one saying that, like, oh, like, we got this trash script from Norma and she's here. And he just looks so worried. Like, it's when like a troublesome family member is coming to dinner, you just like, you're worried in the moment. But when they actually get there, you just put on a show. And put on a show DeMille did. He invited her over to the screening or to the filming. He, just being nice about it. I mean, again, it's just you're inviting a troubled family member into your home. You're worried that they're coming and you're like, oh crap, like now we're going to have to deal with this. But when they get there, you put on a show, you put on a face to it because you don't want to hurt their feelings necessarily. Because I mean, DeMille worked on, I think, a couple pictures with Norma in universe, but we learned earlier on that there was somebody else that was filming a lot of Norma's earlier works. But yeah, I didn't care for DeMille. I thought he was just an awful person.
Well, I guess that's the point of a good movie is it allows you the opportunity to have these moral debates. And I will say that Billy Wilder does an excellent job of directing all of the characters to have their own personal subliminal conflicts with one another, like
Hmm.
based on what their goals are. And all of the main characters in this film have very clearly defined goals, right? Joe is looking
Exactly.
for financial stability. Norma is looking for a return to stardom.
Hmm.
Max is looking out for Norma. I mean, he's literally committed his life to her at this point. And Betty is, is what Joe was, say 10 years ago. I'm just looking
Yeah,
to finally get her name up in the credits of a movie. And they all have
exactly.
these clearly defined goals, and they are all using one another to obtain those goals. And
Hmm.
the people that they're using don't have the same goals as them. So it creates these moral dilemmas, and it makes for really good and well done storytelling. It's not an easy thing to do, but the way that all of the characters are written and then directed and portrayed definitely heightens the tensions. I think
Exactly,
that
and I mean, it's off the back of Gloria Swanson's performance. I mean, she stole the show, definitely. I thought she was honestly the best performance in the film, which isn't that hard when you have people like Joe, who is just not that great of a character and not wanting to provide any, like, obviously, like, he's the driving force, like, he is supposed to be us in the movie, but you kind of also want to enjoy and feel for it, and I couldn't get any sort of emotional attachment, like, to your point with Joe. But Gloria Swanson's performance is iconic. It's referenced in many films. Funny enough, going into this movie, I was like, I feel like I've seen this before. I've seen this exact story played out somewhere else in my life, and it was actually a Twilight Zone episode 6 years later. I love Twilight Zone. It was like my comfort show in college. And I specifically remember an episode like this where it's a silent film actress who pretty much is like sucked into her movies. Like, not literally, but like she's literally just Norma Desmond. She sits at home, she has pictures of herself all over the house, and she's just watching her own movies because she can't live outside of that. But she doesn't have a Joe that she can go to or a Max that's holding everything together. Like, she's just kind of like wallowing in her own misery. And there's also a mention of it in Mrs. Doubtfire, when Robin Williams is like putting up on the makeup and he goes,
I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille.
which it instantly brought me back to me watching that film. I'm like, oh, so that's what that means. But I mean, it's all piggybacking on Swanson's performance, and it's just, I feel like that her performance is one of the reasons why this movie has stood the test of time.
absolutely.
Oh, also, it did win some Oscars as well. It won Best Story and Screenplay, Best Art slash Set Direction, which I will it for a black and white movie. I love how they had to be specific, but I would definitely agree. Just like the set direction and everything, like these beautiful shots of not just LA, but there were some very interesting shots in general. Like the scene where Betsy comes to the mansion when she leaves, and we just see Joe, and the camera kind of pans up, and we see Norma Desmond like overshadowing him, like at the top of the stairs.
Hmm.
Like it was just it's such a good shot. And even like the pool shot, it's been referenced in a lot of other media of the body just floating in the water. Most notably, there's an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry David like walks into his house and there's a body floating in the pool, and it literally looks just like the opening shot of Sunset Boulevard. The one that I will note is Best Score by Franz Waxman, who I know from Bride of Frankenstein. So he has scored Bride of Frankenstein and Rear Window, as well as countless other movies. But I just thought it was very nice, seeing as we both love horror, that he scored one of the best Universal monster movies of all time. And I mean, the score like speaks for itself. Like it's swelling, it mixes in like old Hollywood aesthetics, or like motifs, but then you get to the grand climax at the end, and it's just these swelling strings like building up to this moment. And whether you care for Joe or not, I mean, it's still like there's some impact of it, and it definitely helps with the score.
Yeah, I mean, the score can make or break a movie, definitely.
Hmm.
And I feel like it's a good
And
thing
that's
when
the
it
problem
becomes
with
part.
a lot of older movies, like, and to me, they almost sound the same, but again, I haven't seen a lot of older movies recently, so I just have this, like, one-track pony in my mind of how these scores all sounded back in, like, the 30s to 50s,
Mhm.
but I feel like going into these films on all of these 100, and we're gonna be diving into a little bit more in that era. We'll start to see a little bit more diversity in the scores, which I'm excited about. But I just thought it was really cool that he had scored Bride.
It did the score kinda helped. I think this movie, in a general sense, almost felt like a horror movie. It was not a horror movie, but it had its moments where I was like, "Is this a horror movie?" And the score definitely helped build some of the suspense in those climactic moments.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, he's trapped in this mansion essentially. Like, he pulled up and didn't get kidnapped, but he was pretty much like just kind of locked in there. So
and he ended up getting some major Stockholm syndrome, it felt like. I mean, there were many
absolutely
times. It's the same for when I watch one of those dumb slasher films, and the whole time I'm just like, "Leave, get in your car and go, like,
correct.
go elsewhere," and I
Well,
found
he doesn't
myself
have a
saying that.
car.
Well, yeah, at a certain point in the movie, the car becomes a non-factor, but ultimately, he does decide to do just that and get out of there, and he ends up getting shot for it, so I guess it's not always the best decision. I guess you just have to have a little bit more tact than he did in order to pull it off.
He had plenty of opportunity. He was leaving almost half of the movie. Like, he went to
Yeah,
that New
yeah, but he
Year's Eve
always went back.
party.
He always went back.
He did, but it was all because of like, it's having that crazy girlfriend, like, that just,
So,
"I can't live without you," but he just kept falling right back into it and just falling back into this trap. And
speaking of, though, because the relationship between Joe and Norma is not the only relationship in this movie. In fact,
mm-mm.
this other up and coming screenwriter, Betty Schaefer, again played by Nancy Olson, is this 22-year-old screenwriter who's engaged, and she wants Joe to help her write this idea that she got from one of his scripts, despite the fact that, I mean, she basically shit on Joe's writing for all of the rest of the
I was
movie.
literally about to say that,
I-
like, her opening
so,
scene is so funny that she
so
just, like,
what?
completely is like, "Who's this Joe guy, and what's this, like, trash script?" And the guy's like, "Why
And
don't
then
you
she
talk to him?
becomes
He's right
obsessed
there."
with him, and then she becomes obsessed with him, so I'd
Correct.
like to hear your take on their relationship. It didn't do much for me. I'm glad that it was part of the film, but I didn't really feel a sense of authenticity between their characters, and also the fact that it did end up becoming a semi-romantic relationship, and she's engaged to this other guy, and Joe's literally like, what does Joe have to offer other than, like, some mediocre screenwriting? He's
Lit
completely broke. He doesn't have a
literally
home. He
nothing.
doesn't have a car. I mean, he's chain smoking cigs, probably gonna die in 5 years, right? And
Pause,
she
because
falls head
that's
over heels with him,
literally
and she
everyone in
throws.
this movie, dude. Everyone
He
is smoking their ass off. Like,
Yeah,
when he
dude, I'm
goes
not
to
gonna
the
lie, I'm not a smoker, and this movie made me want a cigarette.
but I feel like when he goes to the New Year, the like pop-in New Year's Eve party, there's a shot that's like sitting at the table, I think, or it's at the punch bowl, and you just see the entire room is just smoked out. It is completely covered in smoke, and everybody is just dragging cigs left and right. Like, to your point, I feel like that's going to happen in a lot of these older movies because, again, nobody really knew the consequences of smoking. Everybody was just like, "Oh, it's cool. See, it's great. It's good for you. It builds character." Like, it's just, you're gonna see that a lot. I just thought it was really funny. I don't even know if like Billy Wilder kind of played off of that because like it was just like
Possibly,
it
yeah.
was cartoonishly
It
smoky in that New Year's Eve
it
party.
was, and there were some story elements based off the cigarette cases that they carried as well.
It's a
You
gift
know,
that Norma gives him, a gold-plated cigarette case.
Mhm. That Betty eventually finds, and so I thought it
Mhm.
was well done. I think one of my favorite scenes is when Betty is in the house. That definitely had a lot of suspense, when she
Yeah.
kinda figures out that he's been living with this old film star, Norma Desmond, like,
Mhm.
when it all kinda accumulates in that, but unfortunately, nothing really came of it, it felt like. I mean, he tells Betty to F off, basically, like, oh, I wanted you so bad, but now go and be engaged to Artie.
Yeah, that was their thing.
And
Their
then he ends up leaving,
relationship was so on and off, and just like you
but he ends
didn't
up leaving
really
the
like.
house anyway. So not why not leave with Betty if that's what you've spent the whole movie trying to obtain?
It's because
Story
he is
arcs in my
so
mind.
engrossed in this lifestyle that he's built for himself now, like, this is all he's ever wanted, like, he doesn't like that's the thing that I was kind of, like, confused about is, like, I thought he was wanting to, like, be a famous screenwriter, but I'm guessing he just really wanted money in the end. I don't know if that's to say for, his motivations and wanting to be a screenwriter, like, maybe he just wants a lot of money to buy all these fancy things and live in this fancy house, because when he's touring Betsy around the mansion, he's really only talking about, like, these are the floors, these are what Valentino danced in, look at the ceiling, that was imported from Portugal. Like, he's only talking about things, he's only talking about, like, the material aspect of what comes out of success in Hollywood. So I think, like, him trying to show that off and trying to have her, like, be wheeled in just by that alone, whereas Betsy just really wants to make it in Hollywood because she's a third generation film family member. Like, her grandma used to work stunts. I think, like, her parents did, like, lighting and costuming on Paramount, and she wanted to be an actress, but somebody told her that her nose was too crooked, so then she got surgery, which I was blown away by, that her nose job cost $300.
Yeah, and Norma's car cost 28,000. Her
Yeah, I was like, my car cost 22,000, dude, and this is like some antique roadster that which ends up being the reason why she ends up going to Paramount Studios anyway, which I thought was that's the thing that Billy Wilder pulls off in this movie. It's funny without trying to be very funny. Like, there's a lot of lines and shot selections in this movie that I was busting out laughing at. Like,
You'll see when we get to the apartment. I think Wilder was made for comedy because the comedy was the best part of this movie, in my opinion. And it is
mhm.
a dark comedy. Like, it definitely is a dark comedy.
Yeah,
To
go
build
ahead.
off real quick before we move on, to build off what you were saying, where Joe is just showing Betty everything about the house, right? And that's convincing. He's become brainwashed enough to the point where the material items mean more to him. And he's basically saying to Betty, how can I leave this? How can I leave this? Like, I want to be with you, but how can I leave all of this? And then Betty leaves, and Joe's like, you know what? Let me leave. So he doesn't even, it just didn't seem like an appropriate character decision for him because he could have left with Betty right then and there. Probably
Correct.
wouldn't have got shot. And, if he was planning on leaving anyway, why not do it with Betty, who he had been chasing after for the entire movie? She leaves because he tells her that he can't, and then he ends up leaving anyway and dies. So
Exactly.
I don't know. That's my own personal frustration, so to speak. It doesn't really take a lot away from the movie. I still think that it's poignant and like it has a lot to say, but that character decision, like a lot of Joe's character decisions, made me, took me out of it a little bit. I would say.
Made you real angry.
Did you find the quote that you were looking for?
I did. So it's when they're working on the script. At this point, this is when we start to find out that Joe is sneaking out at night to go and write this script with Betsy. And he's kind of like that's the thing. Like, he sees a lot of himself in Betsy, but he just keeps like shitting on Betsy, like through half the way through the movie, just being like, oh well, this idea is like a throwaway line, whatever. And Betsy goes, do you hate yourself sometimes? And Joe responds back with constantly. And I feel like that's humor today. Like, it's a lot of like self-defamation, and to see it in a 50s movie was just off-putting. Like, you normally think of like humor in the 50s and it's a lot of like physical gags or just straight up jokes that aren't meant to be taken seriously. So when I heard this in a movie in the 1950s, it was just like Billy Wilder was ahead of his time. It just makes me excited to want to watch The Apartment, because on top of the Norma Desmond performance, like the comedy was like the best aspects of this movie.
Do you have any last minute notes about it before we move on to our kind of ranking system, or do you want to go ahead and head into that?
So what I wanted to bring up is, so you had mentioned that while watching the movie, because we both watched this on Pluto TV, which has commercials, there were some very correctly timed commercials for specific scenes, and it happened to me also while watching this movie on Pluto.
So I'm watching this late at night, like how you had as well. And I'm watching on my projector. and I have a Bluetooth speaker set up behind me, right? Just enjoying the movie. All of a sudden, cuts to Pluto TV. Need a strong wart treatment, and I was like, "Wow, okay." Is this very timely to the 1950s, or is this modern day ads? I was confused. Like, did Billy Wilder just put in an ad sequence here? And
You didn't know
no,
about
I'm
the
watching it on
wart
Pluto
pandemic in
TV.
the
So
1950s? Everybody had warts. I mean, look at that. Norma Desmond's got a little wart on her chin right there on the poster.
and for some reason, it was just way louder than the audio for the film was. And then my
Oh,
favorite ad break was when Betty and Joe are kissing in the motel or wherever it was. Which let me just speak on the fact that like their relationship didn't feel very authentic to me.
it did
Like
not.
it just had a lot of
It
question marks in my
it
mind.
felt dirty watching it, like, you met her fiancé, and he's just this really nice guy, like, Artie is just, like, happy, having a good time, every time Joe's there, he's, like, always wanting to invite him to stuff, and she's just upset because he wants to move to Arizona, and she doesn't wanna leave Hollywood, so she's like, "I'm gonna stay with this broke-ass dude that can't pay for his car just because he lives in the city I wanna live in, and he makes good scripts."
But
It's such a trash
scripts that she
relationship.
hates. So anyway, yes,
Yeah.
we've talked on it, and it'll reflect in the rankings. But they're kissing on the bed, and then it cuts to an ad for Olive Garden, and it's just a hot, greasy breadstick being unsheathed from its basket. And I'm like, wow, okay, subliminal advertising at its finest. I didn't know Olive Garden was trying to, play to human nature like that. But yeah, it was very timely, to
Those
say the least.
breadsticks are addicting, much like Joe's crippling debt. Apparently, that's a turn on for Betsy
So what
or
was
for
your ad
Betty. Sorry.
experience?
So, when I was watching the movie, I was like, "Oh, this is the kiss scene that Parker was talking about." But what I was watching was when Joe returns to the mansion on New Year's after Norma slits her wrists. Which she's fine. I also thought that was really funny that when he gets the call that she slit her wrists or whatever, and he comes back and Norma's just like, "Get away from me." And you just see the wrists on her hands, like, and this is like when we see them kiss, and it fades and it instantly cuts to a Dodge commercial that opens with the word Ram.
Maybe our minds are just in the gutter.
It really is, but it was just like, how could you not laugh at that after you told me that story? Like, it was just so funny that I get a kissing scene too, and instantly it's a commercial that just cuts to just something provocative or something suggestive. And it honestly just made the viewing experience that much more enjoyable. I had to pause the movie. I was cackling so much, dude. But then I saw the scene with Joe and Betty kissing, and I'm like, that's probably what Parker watched. But
Mhm.
maybe I jumped the gun, but it was perfect timing, dude. It was so funny. But
Shall
other than that, we can go ahead and give our total rankings. So what were your scores for this movie?
As this is our first episode, I'm kinda gonna break down this ranking system that I've created and shared with Felix. We're both going to be using it to score our movies and determine their place on the list. It's a scoring system out of 100, and it breaks it down into several different categories that have different point allocations. And the purpose of this is to try and get as much objectivity as possible. Obviously, everyone's going to have a different movie viewing experience. There's no such thing as a completely objective movie review. But this tries to give a little bit of objectivity by breaking it down and ranking it based off different categories. So the categories are enjoyability slash rewatchability, and we'll be ranking that. The second category is simply the story, like how good of a story does it tell objectively, and that's out of 15. The lasting impression of the film, which this has two meanings. One, how timeless is the film? Like, has it permeated the masses and is it critically acclaimed and popular among people? But also its personal lasting impression. How long do you see this movie sticking with you? How long do you anticipate that you'll be thinking about and chewing on this movie in the future? So that's also out of 15. The next category is its visual and auditory appeal out of 10. So how good is the cinematography? How good is the score? So on and so forth. Pretty straightforward. We'll be ranking the pacing out of 10. How well did it keep your attention? How well was it paced? Acting out of 10. So performances all around. Its suspension of disbelief out of 10. And obviously this being within the parameters that the film sets for itself. So obviously, say we have an alien invasion movie It's not a very likely thing to happen, but if it follows all of the rules that it sets for itself, it could still score a perfect 10 in suspension of disbelief. So, how well does the movie follow its own rules? How realistic are its characters' decisions? The next category is originality out of 10. And then the last category is your personal attachment. So, this allows you to allocate up to 5 points. That's completely subjective. How do you feel in terms of your personal attachment to this movie? So all of those add up to 100. It's purposefully meant to make it difficult for movies to score an 100 or a 5 stars, which would be 95 out of 100. So it may be needlessly complex, but this is how I've been ranking movies for a long time. And I think it would be helpful for what we're trying to do here. So with that being said, do you want to break down how you score the movie first, Felix?
Yeah, so and again, I love this system because I going into Letterboxd for the first time, and you had kind of mentioned it, that I feel like I'm a very optimistic and positive person, and I just want to see the good in every movie that I watch. And this certainly helped out, like just really seeing like how I would rank movies because I'm like, how am I ranking Hot Rod for 4.5 stars, but I'm also ranking like Dune Part One 4.5 stars. Like these are completely different like movies. Like how do you break that down? But having this kind of shows that like Dune Part One might be 4.5 stars because it's like visually appealing and it's groundbreaking. But then movies like Hot Rod, I just really like because it holds good memories. This is a very, and these are all of my scores here. So enjoyability and rewatchability. I mean, like Norma Desmond is such a fun character, and again, the humor and like the subtle humor in all of this like made me really enjoy this movie that I would probably go back to and maybe have it be like not, I wouldn't want to kind of down it and say like it's a background movie, but it's something nice to have in the background and you listen to it or watch a little bit when Norma's on screen that I would go back to. So I gave that a 12 out of 15. The story, I mean, it's referenced in a lot of pulp culture, and it's just, it's a film noir, but I mean, in my opinion, obviously it's set in Hollywood, so I think it kind of drives that force a little bit more. And I mean, the story I thought was really good. I thought it was really well done, well directed by Billy Wilder, so I also gave that a 12. Lasting impression, I gave it a 9 because I mean, I felt like I had seen this movie before, but this was the original to go and do it for like this Twilight Zone episode or a lot of other things that it references. So obviously for that aspect, I gave it a 9 because it's left not necessarily a lasting impression on me, but on Hollywood in general because we continue to see it. Visual and auditory appeal. I mean, again, the visuals were stunning. Like having that little time capsule of Hollywood and Los Angeles, and specifically like the Paramount lot was just super nice to watch. The score was really good as well. So I gave that an 8 out of 10. Pacing, I'm kind of going back and forth on because it's like what you said. When we're in the mansion, we kind of feel like we're just stuck there, which I'm guessing is a creative choice by Billy Wilder because Joe is literally stuck in that mansion and he thinks he can't leave. But to your point, he could have left at any time. But a lot of the scenes where we're in the mansion kind of feel like they're dragging on. But I mean, once the story gets moving, like it gets freaking moving, dude. So I thought that after that, the pacing got a little bit better. So an 8 out of 10. Acting 9 out of 10. I mean, Norma Desmond was amazing. All of the cameos like weren't played out, like just throwaways. Like DeMille had like huge part in this movie. While we necessarily might not have liked Joe, I feel like his character, I mean, he played that very well. That's why I gave that a 9 out of 10. Suspension of disbelief, I had a hard time trying to like put a score on because it's a movie about life, like actual real life. Like there's not and I'm going to be very interested to see like what your take on it was, because when I read suspension of disbelief, I'm thinking like it's something that's obviously fake, but you're engrossed in that world. But to that point, it took me back to the 1950s. Obviously, like I've never lived in the 1950s, but I felt like I was there. Like the shots of Los Angeles, the score, and just everybody's performances, like it just felt very authentic and genuine in that idea. That's why I gave it an 8 out of 10. Originality, the story, and the characters, again, still live on to this day. We're still talking about it almost like over 70 years later. So that's why I gave it an 8 out of 10. And then finally, attachment. This was probably one of the first like 1950s movies that I had watched not outside of like, because I actually took a film noir class, and a lot of the movies that we saw were kind of just like slogs, and just I really wasn't engrossed or attached to any of it. So this was probably the first movie like pre 1960 that I really enjoyed and really felt attached to. So that's why I gave it about a 3 out of 5, totaling everything for me to 77.
So this is your first time using this ranking system, right?
Yeah.
It definitely takes some getting used to, in my opinion. So I know what you're saying. Like when I first created this, I was like fiddling with the points, the allocations, the categories. It takes some getting used to, but suspension of disbelief is definitely got to be one of the hardest things to rate.
Especially in a
But you
movie about real life. Like I just
Well, of
felt
course,
like
but that's the purpose of it. So it's like I said, within its own parameters. So for example, and I'll get to it when I'm ranking Sunset Boulevard for its suspension of disbelief. Say that you have a movie that is set in real life and everything is grounded. Like there's nothing that couldn't really happen taking place in it, but the characters just make completely idiotic decisions that no sensible person would actually make, even within the rules defined for that universe. So say it's a movie that's trying to play itself very seriously and it takes place in reality, but the people are doing idiotic things that like don't
it's fair.
progress the story or make sense, then it would get a low score for suspension of disbelief. If you have a movie about aliens invading while 100 earthquakes are going on and China and America are one like united country, obviously that's not a movie based in reality. But if
Yeah.
it follows all of the rules, the geopolitical structure that the movie sets for itself, and the aliens behave in a consistent way, then it could score a 10 out of 10 for a suspension of disbelief. So does that kind of make sense?
No, that does.
So
Like
with that
Joe
being
could
said,
have left the house at any point in time, but he just
yes,
kept coming back.
exactly. So with that being said, I'll dive into my rankings for Sunset Boulevard. In terms of enjoyability and rewatchability, I cannot say that I thoroughly enjoyed watching this, and I can say with certainty that I probably won't give it a rewatch unless I'm watching it with someone that is like, "Hey, let's put on Sunset Boulevard." I kind of found it to feel a lot longer than its runtime, and while I appreciated the film, I didn't super enjoy it. So I'm gonna give it a 6 out of 15 for enjoyability and rewatchability. Just less than half. Not to knock it, just kind of my own. This is where this is a category where subjectivity really plays a part, and that's how I personally felt about it.
Mhm.
The story, however, is a different story. I think that it's a timeless story, and it's one that's told with a lot of grace and a lot of nuance. So I gave it a 12 out of 15. I think that the story is strong. It definitely has its weaker points, and there's some subplots that take place that didn't really make sense for me, such as the relationship and decisions made between Betty and Joe, and some of Joe's own decisions, the way that that's written. In terms of lasting impression, I don't see this movie really sticking with me a whole lot other than the performances that were given. However, it's clearly a timeless classic, one that has made a lasting impression on Hollywood in general. So, with that being said, I gave it a 12 out of 15 for its lasting impression. It's not going to have a super long impression in my mind, but it's clearly made its mark. And as you said, Felix, been referenced in countless other materials. For its visual and auditory appeal, with it being a black and white movie, I thought that it was really beautiful. There were some shots in the big mansion that made you feel claustrophobic, which is a nice juxtaposition. And I really liked the score. There weren't like sweeping or any like major shots where I literally verbalized like, wow, like that's incredible. So it was good and not groundbreaking in my opinion. I give its visual and auditory appeal an 8 out of 10. When it comes to the pacing, I think this was definitely a weak point of the movie for me. It's never a good sign when you're checking how much time you have left in the movie, and I did do that a couple of times, I hate to say. Definitely times in the mansion felt grueling, if I'm being honest. And again, that could be a creative decision, but nonetheless, I felt that it negatively impacted the movie. So for the pacing, I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. The performances all across the board were strong. Obviously, Gloria Swanson as Norma Desmond is an all-time performance, one absolutely for the books that will continue to live on. And I think that Max's character was very well acted by Eric von Stroheim, and all around the acting was pretty good. I would say that Gloria Swanson's performance is the only one where I'm like, that's all time. So with that being said, not a perfect 10, but I'm going to give acting a 9 out of 10. For suspension of disbelief, there were definitely times where I felt questionable decisions were made, and some things didn't necessarily line up. But all in all, it wasn't horrible. It wasn't eye rolling, and I wasn't screaming at the film, being like, "This doesn't make any fucking sense. Why are you doing this?" So it's okay. I'll give it a 7 out of 10 for suspension of disbelief. Originality. This movie is kind of the definition of original. Like, it put together a lot of things that were happening in real life, and told an authentic story about that, for its time. However, it wasn't, in my mind, the story wasn't quite a perfect 10 in terms of originality. I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. It's been so influential. I'm kind of stingy when it comes to giving out perfect scores. So I think 9 out of 10 is suiting for originality. My personal attachment is going to be a 1 out of 5. I I really like the movie. I think it's an excellent
Brutal.
movie that a lot of people can enjoy. It didn't really scratch a lot of itches for me personally. So my personal attachment will be a 1 out of 5. Add all of those scores up and you get 70 out of 100.
With the average being is a 73.5.
All right. And that, for me, that's a 3.5 out of 5 stars on Letterboxd.
You said 3 stars?
3.5 stars, a 73 would be.
3.5 stars.
And that's also what I personally gave it on Letterboxd.
I ended up giving it a 4-star, but because I was like, oh, because it's so hard to review it on Letterboxd when you could see like literally the bars of everybody else that has reviewed this movie, and the 4-star rating was like, I think it was either over the 5 stars, like overwhelmingly over, but it was hard to not join the club, dude. I really liked this movie. And I could see why it's on this list and so high. It was 35 or 32, I think.
Yeah, it's 35 on the all-time.
35 exactly. So I mean, it's up there for a reason. It's such a classic movie that I didn't at first actively watching it fall asleep through. But I really liked this movie, man.
All right. So with that being said, Sunset Boulevard, of course, moves into the number 1 spot on our personal all-time list, for films that are taken from the Letterboxd 100 top 100 narrative feature films. So I'm interested to see who will be joining Sunset Boulevard on the list next episode.
Let's pull her up, my guy. There she is.
The moment that I personally have been waiting for. I love discussing the
dude.
movies, but spinning the wheel, oh my gosh, it gets my mind going.
It's just fun, man. Like after watching Sunset Boulevard, I'm like, I can't wait to spin the wheel and see what's gonna happen. So now,
Let's count it
obviously
down.
we've already taken out Sunset Boulevard. So now there are 99 entries left in the series. So whenever, do you have any final thoughts on Sunset Boulevard before we hang it up in the rafters of this endeavor?
So long, my dear. You were I will say, a great first film for this series. I really do think so. So wasn't my cup of tea per se, but still objectively a great movie, and excited to see what's next.
Me too, dude. So with that, we're gonna give her a
Count us down,
spin.
Felix. Count us down.
3, 2, 1. Oh my god!
Oh, you mentioned it. Oh my gosh.
Heck
No way.
yeah.
You literally mentioned it this episode. We're now 2 for 2 on movies being mentioned before actually being picked.
I think this wheelofnames.com actually just uses the same CIA agent as my TikTok account, dude. It's listening for sure. But yeah,
That's
so
crazy.
Sherlock Jr. is the oldest movie on this list. It's literally 100 years old. And funny enough that we mentioned Buster Keaton because he is the star of this movie.
And the director.
So
So
that
yes,
is
this has
what a
the same
crazy connection.
This has the same average rating on Letterboxd, 4.4 out of 5 stars. However, it is the number 71 film on the list. So I think maybe just a lot less people have seen it. But
Maybe.
wow, what are the odds? What are the odds of Sherlock Jr. being picked? So
Look at
this will
that,
be
dude.
interesting. It shouldn't be hard. It's only 45 minutes long.
I think it's on YouTube.
Possibly. So yes,
Yeah.
directed by Buster Keaton, Sherlock Jr. will be our next entry. I could watch it right now. Shoot, only 45 minutes. Nice.
You got
Thanks,
do you have
Wheel.
the blurb for it?
Yeah, so Sherlock Jr. came out in 1924, directed by Buster Keaton. Every inch of footage holds such a laugh. So we're moving into the true comedy territory. A film projectionist longs to be a detective and puts his meager skills to work when he is framed by a rival for stealing his girlfriend's father's pocket watch. So a
Oh.
silent comedy, gonna be great.
We'll leave that as the lasting image for what is going to be an interesting movie to watch as always. So funny enough, I watched a little bit of it while making our intro video because it's included in there. And this shot specifically when he's like reading the book, it just looks like a lot of fun, man. Like while looking up Buster Keaton after the Sunset Boulevard episode, it just made me really excited. Like Buster Keaton is he's timeless. Like he's referenced still to this day, even in a movie that's at this point 100 years old. It's gonna be fun, and like you said, it's just a nice little clip. It's 45 minutes long, and we'll get through it and give it the good old ranking. And it's I'm excited. I'm excited for this for sure.
Me too. Me too. Should be a good one.
Well, other than that, I think that's gonna do it for this week's episode. Parker, where can people find you?
Of course, on Letterboxd will be the social that I choose to plug, as we are the LetterBros podcast. So you can find me on Letterboxd at Parker_Paget, spelled with 2 T's at the end. You'll get a head start on what we end up ranking these films. I think we both had our reviews posted a day before recording. So check us out.
Exactly. And then I'm Ezio911, ETZIO911 on Letterboxd. Again, just keep the conversation going. Let us know what you thought of Sunset Boulevard. Let us know what you think of Sherlock Jr. And until then, we will see you at the movies.